Well, great. Well, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. We're delighted to welcome back for our second of 3 classes with Dr. Paul Liptz live from Israel with us. It's evening there, morning in LA. And so I know that you weren't able to be with us last week. His lecture is live on our YouTube site. col-me.org on YouTube, and you can catch that important lecture about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in the holy, unholy city of Jerusalem. So take it away, Professor.
Hi, good morning. It's lovely to see you again. This is a longish session, so for those, I'm delighted to know it's being recorded, because if you miss something, it's always a great place to be able to go back. So I'll try and cover today the whole issue of the conflicts between Israel and our neighbors, and unfortunately our conflicts are fairly broad. But at the same time as we've been a country in crisis, we've also been a country trying in one way or other to make things better. So having lived here over 54 years now, I must say one thing. This is a country you never get bored in. Something is always happening. And I've got a feeling that my presentation today will give you the feeling that things change rapidly, sometimes for the best, and that's always the good news. So what we've got here is, oopsies, good. So just some general comments. Is your screen showing that this meeting is being recorded, or is it only mine?
No, it's all you're being recorded. Paul, you're on mute. Wait, Paul, you're on mute.
Okay, I'm on now. Fine.
Now you're good.
So this whole issue of the Middle East is fascinating. Just want to make one comment initially, and that is the whole question of, you hear this comment, the Middle East conflict, and people often understand that as being the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. Just want to say something which has always amazed me, having been in this realm for a long time, is that unfortunately the Middle East is filled with conflicts. And so therefore the reality is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is obviously a very important one and one that we would all like to be able to solve, is only one of the many that go on in this wider area. But we'll be concentrating on Palestine and Israel in today's session. So if we look at what was happening, we see that in the first stage of really trying to think that there might be something like a Jewish state or a Jewish homeland comes about with the Balfour Declaration in 1917. And although that was just the declaration between Britain and the Jewish people, it becomes an official declaration with the League of Nations in 1922. And that really, the League of Nations was the forecomer of the United Nations. And that really means that as early as 1922, the international body in the world had already recognized that the Jewish people had a right to a homeland and or state, and that was always a big discussion. The first time that a map ever came about was in 1937, when the British sent out a very impressive group of people called the Peel Commission, and they decided that the only way to really work out how to deal with this conflict in this particular part of the world was to try and build a 3-part area, let's call it that. So here we find the Jewish state. This little orange was what the Peel Commission wanted to give to the Jewish people. The largest area we see all the way down from Eilat and Aqaba in the south up to pretty much into the Galilee. This whole area would be called the Arab state. And then there was going to be yet another area which would remain under the British mandate, and that from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv.
I think we lost his sound and picture for a moment. There we go.
What is really going to happen on the international level. Here we come to the most important document that we have, which is the September 1947 UN Committee report, which led to a UN General Assembly adoption. It was called the famous 181. And this was accepted by a majority. Those voting in favor, there were 33 countries, against were 13 countries, and there were 10 abstentions. Interestingly enough, the United Kingdom abstained as well, pretty much believing that this whole thing would fail. How could it possibly happen that the Jewish people would bring about a state? Remembering, by the way, that this is 2 years after the end of the Second World War. People had seen what had happened to the Jewish people in Europe, and it didn't seem that anything good was going to happen. What did the United Nations offer? They offered an interesting plan. All this green would be the Jewish state. By the way, the difference between this map and the Pure Commission was that the whole of the desert area, the Negev area, had been handed over to the Jews, very much as a result of the intervention of President Harry Truman, who was very important in supporting this particular project. The brown areas were going to be the Arab state, areas in the south connected over here, where you see the cursor, the West Bank, called by many people Judea and Samaria, leading up to the Galilee, this whole area here. This area would be called the Arab state. Please pay attention that the word Palestinian does not come into the language at this time. And then there would be an international city, which would be Jerusalem and Bethlehem, somewhere in the middle. Now, in both the case of the Peel Commission and the UN resolution, the Zionist movement agreed, believing, and you can imagine that for some people, this little country over in the green didn't seem all that viable, saying this is a whole lot better than the other alternatives. On the other hand, the Arabs rejected it. The reason the Arabs rejected it is that, somewhat like the British, they didn't believe that anything was going to come of it. So, this is almost an academic event. So why agree to something which is obviously going to fail? Yeah, sorry, I'm using my cursor here. So then we go into the next stage. There was the War of Independence, called War of Independence by Israel, and Al-Nakba, the catastrophe in Arabic. That brought about an armistice agreement. Armistice agreements are essentially ceasefire agreements, and that brought about a change in the map that the UN had initially recommended. Here we have blue, which is the lines of the UN Resolution 181. Then we have the red over here, 3 bits of red, and this is a very important part of the red. This was area which was captured by the Israeli army in the battle with the 5 Arab countries, in addition to which we fought Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, as well as Iraq, but Iraq was not involved in the agreement. And then, once again, it was believed that there would be this little area, which would be an international city. Well, as an agreement between Israel and Jordan decided that Jerusalem could not be an international city and would have to be divided between Israel receiving West Jerusalem replaced by permanent borders. That never happened. From the Israeli perspective, this map is much better than the UN map. of 181 because it increased the area under Israeli control by 20% and gave Israel some parts of Jerusalem which hadn't initially been intended. Then, within a short period of time, there was the Sinai campaign, 1956 Sinai campaign, a very strange kind of campaign from any perspective. The reason the campaign got off the ground was essentially because of the feeling of the British and the French. The British were very upset with Nasser, the president of Egypt, because he had nationalized the Suez Canal. And the French were very upset because there was an Algerian uprising against them. And therefore, pretty much as an anger towards the Arab world, the British and the French suggested that Israel should attack Egypt by taking over Sinai. And within a short period of time, both the British and the French would send in their forces. The long and the short of this particular war was that as a result of the January 1957 Eisenhower Doctrine, doctrine, President Eisenhower at the time, demanded the full withdrawal of the troops. So therefore, this whole area, which had been won in the war, essentially by the Israeli forces, that area was given back. The good news about this particular campaign was that between 1957 and 1967, there was a UN emergency force which patrolled this large area of Sinai, which I know extremely well, having served in the Israeli military, and a great deal of my military service was actually in this particular area. The Sinai campaign is a massive area, especially coming from Little Israel, and it led to an element of quiet. So when we talk about war of swords and war of words, here essentially the war of swords was very much reduced, but there was actually no final agreement that was forwarded. Things changed in 1967. 1967 had a significant number of reasons for the start of the war. As a result of the 1956 campaign, this area over here, the Straits of Tiran, this area from Eilat in the south, all the way through the Straits over here, this area was open to Israel. Therefore, from 1956 onwards, Israel could use this area getting to the wider world. From an Israeli perspective, the Suez Canal was still not open. This was a problem for Israel because Suez Canal is actually an international area, international sea in a sense, which should be open to everyone. The Egyptians hadn't accepted it. In May 1967, President Nasser of Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran, closed the Straits of Tiran, which means this exit to the south from Eilat to the big wide world were then closed. From an Israeli perspective, this was a casus belli. It seemed that this war was going to be a disaster for the state of Israel. There was a full involvement of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, not militarily involved, but certainly supporting the Arab countries. Jordan was involved, Syria was involved, and Lebanon to a very limited extent. All these countries were involved in the war, but in a very dramatic 6 days, Israel took over this green area, the Sinai, which they had actually taken over for a short period back there in 1956. This area, which had been under the Jordanian government, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, was taken over by Israel, and the Golan Heights, which had been under Syrian control, was taken over by Israel. The casualties to the Arab side were tremendous, over 18,000 people, and 700 Israelis were killed. There was an expectation very much after the Six-Day War that Israel was now seen as a powerful country, which had not been the case certainly in 1947 to 1949. And there was very much a hope that we would sit down and have peace. And I say that because I had arrived in Israel one day before the Six-Day War, and I very much remember the euphoria after the war, saying that as a result of Israel showing itself as being a permanent player in the Middle East, that the state was not going to be wiped out, that would mean that things were going to get a whole lot better. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And after a short period, a period of 6 years or so, we go yet to the next stage of the conflict. And by this stage, things are becoming very different in a strange kind of way. The Yom Kippur War, which is the Israeli Jewish term, and the Ramadan War, which is the Arab term, seemed to be a war that changed to a large extent the euphoria which Israel had experienced. 1967, Israelis, and talking very much from personal experience, Israelis were convinced that really we could do anything we wanted. Now, what happened is that Israel became overconfident, didn't listen to some of the messages coming from the other side. And in fact, there were some very detailed reports of one or two spies in Egypt who were telling us Egypt was about to declare a war for many reasons, of which we can't go into them just at this moment. The Arab side, the Egyptians in the south and the Syrians in the north declared war on Israel. It had two very important components. The first component was that the black line group that you see here, this black line in the north and the southern black line over here, was the third Egyptian army, massive, gigantic army. And in the first days of the Yom Kippur Ramadan War, it pretty much felt in Israel that we were going to get defeated, which was very shocking, particularly after the bravado feeling we had in 1967. The problem that the Egyptians made is that when they crossed over to the eastern side of the Suez Canal, this whole long area over here, they didn't move over with any supplies, no food, and a limited amount of military equipment. And so what happened within a short period, you have thousands and thousands of soldiers, of Egyptian soldiers, stuck on this side of the Suez Canal without any food or water. At the same time, Israel had moved to the western side of the Suez Canal, and here we see the very, very large Israeli army presence on the western side. And some of the comments were, wow, we're on the western side of the Suez Canal, that we're in Egypt now, and well, isn't that a great situation? Because there's 100 meters between us and Cairo, and there were even suggestions in Israel that it would be a good idea to occupy Cairo. All I can say is, thank God that didn't happen, because it would have been absolutely crazy. But here come the interesting concept of competing narratives. For Israelis, the Yom Kippur War was a great success. The massive Third Army could have been starved, and we could have sat there for a good few months, and many of these people would die. By the way, the Commission of Inquiry after this particular war was fascinated, because it included some Jewish sources which speak very, very clearly about what you should do with a prisoner. These soldiers were essentially prisoners. They have to be looked after, they have to be fed. And the Commission of Inquiry, in terms of how the criticisms of the government, particularly of Prime Minister Golda Meir, essentially said the Israeli army behaved as an army should behave, and that is to provide basic food rations for a group who are essentially prisoners at that time. Israel saw this as a tremendous success, but at the same time, Egyptians saw in 1967, and therefore both sides interpreted the war as a success. Quite an interesting situation. What happened in Syria was somewhat different. Here we have this dark gray area of the Golan Heights. The Syrian forces started coming down the Golan Heights. There was a tremendous fear that they would actually get to Tiberias in the south, on the other side of the Lake Kinneret, and that didn't happen. The Syrian forces were pushed back, and Israel took over this black area over here, which once again wasn't all that far away from Damascus. Now, the interesting thing about this war, in terms of how you move forward, was that it started negotiations. And the question has often been asked by my Israeli students, why did negotiations start in this particular situation? And that was because this very, very important sentence that we have here. From the Egyptian perspective, honor had been returned. And in Islamic society, like all groups in the world, didn't matter which religious group one belongs to, there are certain values which are supreme values. In the Arab and Islamic world, honor is the most important issue, honor in all realms. And here, from an Egyptian perspective, their honor had been returned. After the humiliation of 1967, they were now the winners of the war. And that started a very important process, which was going to have long-term implications in terms of 1974. The disengagement talks started over here, the Egyptian-Israeli disengagement talks, slow discussions, which led to the return of portions of Sinai back to Egypt. So this was a return of land as part of a process of improving relationships. A few years later, and in the Middle East, things work very, very slowly. We get to the situation of the November 1977 visit by President Anwar Sadat to Israel. How could he do it? Remember, Israel and Egypt had been the worst enemies. Israeli sources and Egyptian sources are filled with anger towards the enemy, be it Israel or Egypt. Anwar Sadat, very much influenced by the Yom Kippur War, the Ramadan War, felt, well, this is really, we can change the reality. He was a very brave man, and as a result of two brave people, on the one hand, President Anwar Sadat, who we see here, and Menachem Begin, a right-wing leader, who was sometimes compared with Richard Nixon, who in this famous concept of how to improve relations between America and China, was a good idea to send over some table tennis people, which is only part of the real story. And in between, we have Jimmy Carter, who, although he is highly criticized in Israeli society, played a very important role in the picture we see here. The process was a complex process. Initially, Sadat visited Israel. He received an amazing welcome, but there was total outrage in the Arab world. He had really gone out of the consensus of Arab behavior in terms of Israel. In September 1978, there were the Camp David Accords, which we're seeing over here, which was yet one other stage of the agreement. In addition were the Nobel Peace Prizes for President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin. And within the Israel-Egyptian peace treaty, there were some very important clauses which dealt with Palestinian self-government. This was going to be something which I'll pick up just a little later, because the truth is that the Palestinian issue, which I know in the wider world is very much a talking point, the reality is that in terms of actually deciding what role the Palestinians had in this whole arena has been very much sidelined. We saw the map, the Peel Commission map speaks about an Arab state. The UN 181 agreement speaks about the Arab state. And here for the first time in 1979, we're beginning to see the Palestinian issue being mentioned. President Sadat did not speak about a full government at that time, but his hope was that it would eventually lead to that kind of situation. The reality of the peace treaty was a continuation of the 1974 disengagement, very complex set of discussions whereby there were three different stages. Egypt would receive back the Sinai, which it had lost in the 1967 Six-Day War. Red initially, here the lighter color, and eventually yet another lighter color, going over in a very, very carefully worked out situation. Something then went wrong, which, although the peace treaty is extremely important, had two disastrous aspects as far as the Egyptians were concerned. The first was obviously the assassination of President Anwar Sadat. He had risked his life, as we look at it in later events, in an attempt to establish peace with Israel. Unfortunately, leaders losing their lives, as we know in the United States, and as we also know from Israel, brave people becoming assassinated really can deeply disturb the realities of a country at a particular time. The other loss, as far as Egypt was concerned, is that Egypt became an outcast within the Arab world for an extended period of time. However, in 1982, diplomatic relations were established. Just let me say something about this particular agreement of 1982. Some people have described this as a cold peace. My view is that any kind of peace, I don't really care exactly what it was, how one defines it. I was absolutely thrilled that this peace treaty was signed. I was deeply troubled by the assassination of President Sadat, but at least the diplomatic relations were established, which means an Egyptian ambassador sat in Tel Aviv, an Israeli ambassador, one of whom I know very well, sat in Cairo, and this slowly but surely established a relationship, although one can't hide the fact that a very significant number of Egyptians had not been in favor of the initiative of Anwar Sadat. We move on to yet another approach. So many countries in the world have been interested in the Middle East. It's a part of the globe where people feel it's extremely important. It's, as we know, when we look at the story of Jerusalem and the three religions, there is a tremendous amount of concentration on this particular part of the world, partly for religious reasons and also for strategic reasons, the importance of the Suez Canal, in addition to which the oil and gas which exists in this part of the world. All these things really bring a tremendous amount of attention. And in 1991, President George H.W. Bush put forward to the Congress the possibility that there was another way of dealing with things. And I think new initiatives are always very, very important and very interesting. The Madrid Peace Conference was an interesting approach of, in terms of, instead of dealing with bilateral relations between two countries, Israel and Egypt, the President Bush decided that that would be another way of dealing with it. And therefore, in a period of cooperation between America and the Soviets, with the involvement of representatives, obviously from Israel, but Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and the Palestinians as well, the idea was that if you all sit down in a big room together, and there was a big, beautiful room, which was existed in Madrid at the time, that would make things easier. From an Israeli perspective, there was a great deal of cynicism. Here we find all these dignitaries over, and here somewhere over is the then Prime Minister Shamiri, who he leaders on the one side against the one representative from Israel. What did happen, however, and the good part of the essentially failed Madrid Peace Conference, was that initiated secret Israeli-Jordanian negotiations and, very important, Israeli-Palestinian talks. This was pretty much the first time, although there had been other shorter periods and maybe not nearly as significant, but at least in 1993, the Israelis and Palestinians started talking together. And that led to something very, very dramatic. Here we come to what I've considered for a long time as being one of the most complex kind of ways of trying to achieve non-violence and elements of peace, P-I-E-C-E, of P-E-A-C-E. And that was the two-stage Oslo talks, which started in 1993 and ended in 1995. The issue was, I think, made particularly difficult because unlike the good relations between Sadat and Begin, the relations between the two particular leaders, in this case, Rabin and Arafat, were terrible. Some of you maybe even remember that dramatic picture in September 1993 on the White House lawn where there's the handshake, and you can literally see that Rabin's hand doesn't want to go forward. He's kind of almost held back, and eventually, very much as a result of Bill Clinton, and you can see Clinton's hand symbolically and in reality, bringing the two leaders together. This was a very, very important period. But there was total lack of understanding between the leaders. And therefore, what we're finding in this period, the whole question of Oslo, is that the lack of faith, the lack of belief on the two sides was so high that it became extremely difficult to move forward. And that's really why this is an agreement which took almost 2 years to try and finalize. In between the process came yet another very important development, and that was the Israeli-Jordanian declaration, the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty of 1994. It had two different stages. One was in the United States, in Washington, where we had Hussein, Rabin, and Clinton, and then afterwards in the Arava Valley in southern Israel, where you had the second signing. This was a kind of much easier declaration and understanding than the Israeli-Palestinian one. The reason is that Jordan and Israel have had fairly good relations as early as 1949 and after the Nakba, after Israel's war of independence. The treaty, in a sense, is a clean treaty. What is described is clear to everyone. There was very, very little ambivalence in the relations and the negotiations between the two countries. which included refraining from acts of belligerency or hostility, the allocation of water to Jordan, by the way, which the amount of water to Jordan has recently been increased, and generally it established and moved forward to normalization. I think on this level, one has to add one very important point, and that was the tremendously important role of Bill Clinton. When Israelis felt vulnerable, Israel kind of pretty much alone in the Middle East until about a year and a half ago, except for the two agreements between Egypt and Jordan, the role of Bill Clinton was extremely important. Israelis liked him. They felt very close to him. We know when Rabin was assassinated, he and many, many other leaders of the world came to Israel. And I think his particular position and his commitment to trying to improve the position in the Middle East and clearly caring a genuine care for the state of Israel, I think this is something which we have to clearly state. Then we go back to the Palestinian issue. So this whole process is carrying on, and here we get in 1995 to what is called Oslo II. Just like to say something personal here. In the Israeli army, I had initially been in the war in Lebanon in a field unit, and then transferred to the education unit of the Israeli army in the reserves. And a number of us, initially there were 5, and then more people were involved, were asked to try and explain to Israeli officers in particular, and also to non-commissioned officers and to regular soldiers, to try and explain to them what's happening. See, we have to look at it from a situation of deep conflict between warring nations. How do you move forward? You really have to not only deal with an agreement, official agreement, but you also have to try and explain to the population that although there's always a risk involved of any kind of peace treaty, there's a gain. And I clearly remember the ongoing number of sessions that I held trying to explain, which here appears on one screen, one slide of a PowerPoint, but what appears here is, in fact, the condensed form of a very, very large book of about 180 pages. And it's a process. The Oslo Accords were different from almost any other agreement that I've ever known. And that was the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, was going to be divided into 3 areas. There's going to be Area A, which was under full Palestinian control, these dark places. Area B, which are the light brown over here, which were joint Israeli-Palestinian, and Area C, which was under Israeli control. Now, whenever I would pull out my large map of the Oslo II agreements, the response of the army officers was, "This is crazy. I mean, what's going on here?" Well, the reason that this idea, very unusual idea, influenced by a significant number of diplomats and other people, certainly with the involvement of the Palestinian leaders and the Israeli leaders, was let's work slowly. Let's build trust. And I think that is the word that I would use again and again and again when I was giving my presentations to the Israeli officers. The idea was as follows. True, the Palestinian A areas are small, but by establishing trust with time, the B areas would become A areas. That means these little bits, which is kind of looks like some crazy idea, would slowly change. Now, what was this map all about? I mean, where does it come from? It comes from initially that areas A are where you have large numbers of Palestinians, area B where you have much less Palestinian villages, and area C where you almost have no Palestinians at all. So the idea was to start with the Palestinian people, to show them that slowly but surely Israel was working towards a better life for the Palestinians, and on the Israeli side, to try and explain to them, look, the Palestinians are getting something and we're getting something, and therefore it's going to be great for everyone. The tragedy of the Oslo Accords were the two events which appear at the bottom of the screen. Firstly, the November 1995 assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. Once again, if Sadat had been killed by Egyptian members of the Muslim Brotherhood, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli modern Orthodox law student. And in 1996 started ongoing suicide bombings. And this was really essentially the end of, at this time in history, the best possibility of establishing a Palestinian state of some kind or the other, and explaining why it's worthwhile to the Israeli population. Things went quiet for some year, few years, 7 years, and then came yet another attempt. This was July 2000, the Camp David, where you have a new player. The new player is Ehud Barak, former chief of staff, just a very committed military man. Unfortunately, he didn't consult with people, and that weakened his political ability. Yasser Arafat, still very much his military. There were many, many components and many reasons why this particular agreement fell through. What was interesting was that Ehud Barak, the Israeli prime minister, had actually offered orally to withdraw from 91% of the West Bank, but not East Jerusalem. Now, in a certain situation, this could have been a successful venture. It's true it was orally, but Barak, from the Israeli perspective, Ehud Barak was waiting to see if Yasser Arafat would respond, at least initially, to the idea, not yet written down, and true, without East Jerusalem. But there were things to discuss. In fact, a little later, Clinton and Barak even went further and offered 94% of the West Bank to the Palestinian people. Well, it isn't everything, and certainly they would have wanted East Jerusalem as well, but it was extremely important. How can we describe that this didn't go anywhere? Dennis Ross, who I'm sure many of you have heard about, Dennis Ross is probably the most sophisticated voice that we have in terms of events in our region in the Middle East, maintained that Arafat rejected the agreement because the agreement essentially said this is the end of conflict. And from Dennis Ross's approach, Arafat was really not prepared to end conflict. He was a military man in one way or the other from start to finish. New things out of the blue, August 2005, totally unexpected. Ariel Sharon, then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, decides that he, almost without consulting any of his party members, spoke about unilateral withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. What we see here is the Gaza Strip. All these little red spots are where you have some of the 7,000 to 8,000 Israeli settlers. It was a very dramatic moment of Israeli history. It almost looked as there was going to be a civil war between those who wanted to disengage, to leave Gaza, talking about Israelis leaving Gaza, and those who wanted to stay in Gaza. As late as December 2004, the Prime Minister's statement on disengagement was 46 to 45. It sounds a little bit like some American politics at present. Unfortunately, although Israel disengaged, the conflict with Gaza carries on till today. We're getting towards the end of the presentation, and we really have yet one other stage. The 2008 peace talks with a new Palestinian leader, and this was kind of very much the feeling that with Arafat no longer around, he'd passed away, it was going to be a good idea to approach Mahmoud Abbas. I know some of Mahmoud Abbas's colleagues. I don't know him personally, but I know some of his people who work with him. And at least in 2008, he seemed to have a considerable amount of power within the Palestinian population. I mention it because at the moment he's perceived as a very, very weak leader of the Palestinian Authority. But he was a new personality. And therefore, the then Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, who actually was in a very weak position politically, involved in a complex court case, he made a very dramatic statement where he offered almost total withdrawal from the West Bank. We're talking, in the 90s. And rather than saying that East Jerusalem would be under Israeli control, he suggested that the old city would be under international control, something similar to what we had seen earlier with both the Peel Commission and 181 and the UN partition plan of 1947. It went back and forwards. There were good days and bad days. I remember them very clearly. Without doubt, of all the particular events that I've been following over the years, this was the best chance to ever create a two-state solution. It seems to be, and there are many alternative narratives, what I'm going to present, it seems to be that in the long run, a different Abbas at a different moment of history would have acted differently. And in June of this year, we find that Abbas did say that he regrets that he hadn't signed. Had he signed the agreement, and if it had actually succeeded, which we don't know, and if Prime Minister Olmert had actually managed to persuade the Israeli population to go for the agreement, this was really probably the highest moment that we've ever got in terms of the two-state solution. And the last attempt, and just take a minute or two on this, is with the Trump-Jared Kushner peace plan. I remember I was in Orange County in January 2020, and I remember this plan came out. We'd heard about the preparation in advance. It was a massive document. It was very complex. Here we see yet, the importance of maps. We see again and again. He has a very, very complex map to try and explain what would be under Israeli control and what would be under Palestinian control. It's a very complex issue. The long and the short of it, the failure of the peace plan was not because some of the conditions wouldn't be fairly appealing. For example, past President Trump's promise of $50 billion international dollars of international investment. By the way, there was no way of understanding how that figure would actually be reached in terms of international involvement. There was also some very problematic clauses, one being that 350,000 Israeli Arabs, Israeli-Palestinian Arabs, with Israeli citizenship would be transferred to the Palestinian state, but they'd never even been consulted. And the long and the short of it was that this whole plan in the long run was really one of the least successful. And that was because there was absolutely no negotiations with or input from the Palestinians, whereas Trump defined this as the deal of the century. They defined this as the slap of the century. Interestingly enough, and I conclude on this, the United Arab Emirates regarded this as a serious initiative, and even Saudi Arabia claimed that it appreciates the efforts which were made. I mentioned these 2 points because next week, when we go into the very contemporary period, we'll see that we'll be talking once again about the UAE and the Saudi Arabia. Thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you for that amazing overview of where we're at, and with the, of course, with the Abraham Accords. I thank you, Professor, for really kind of raising the ideals of the process. And, you know, it was certainly shocking. I remember when Sharon had the withdrawal from Gaza, and some of those scenes with the settlers were very disturbing. But you know, nevertheless, a requirement and necessary. And as we talk about, you know, what should Israel do next, is a really critical piece of the puzzle. So I thank you. I know you have to run early today, so save your questions up for next week. Professor will be with us next Tuesday at 11. And our topic next week is?
I've got it right here. Which page is it? It's somewhere over on my desk over here. Israel in the Middle East, challenges and opportunities. I'll just read it very quickly. Israel initially had to deal with the Arab League boycott and the antagonism of the communist world. The 1979 and peace agreement between Israel and Egypt and the 1994 treaty with Jordan improved Israel's position in the Middle East, which we've discussed today. 2020 to 2021 have seen exciting new realities as a result of normalization with the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco, and improved relations with Jordan after years of tension with the Sudan. And I'd just like to really say goodbye to you with a comment. I have been, for over 54 years now, been so closely involved with these issues, speaking to people from different countries, not always in Israel, but many of us would meet Arab colleagues in various countries in Europe. And I'll speak about it more next week in terms of how one negotiates when one's in the Middle East. But I must say, in terms of the broader situation in the Middle East, I think Israel is at a better position than it's ever been. From the days of being a boycotted country by the Arab League and the
I think we lost you, Professor. There you go.
Let's
You're
talk
back.
about it.
Well, we're going to build on what we learned today. We'll build on it for next Tuesday in terms of talking about this Abraham Accords and this new spirit of cooperation between Israel and many of the surrounding Arab countries, and the pressure that's actually putting on the Palestinians. And that will be the question that we'll really talk about next week. Just a quick reminder, 2 other great learning opportunities just this week. Rabbi Levy at 9:30 on Thursday morning will be pushing out over the next few weeks on Facebook Live only, exploring the Siddur and the prayer book and liturgy. Lunch and Learn returns for our monthly Lunch and Learn on Thursday at noon with me. You can sign up. That's only on Zoom. You can sign up on our website. And again, Saturday morning, Rabbi Levy is in person with a Shabbat holiness hike at Franklin Canyon. And this Sunday at 4 p.m., Dr. Stephen Windmuller on Zoom only is presenting about the rise of hate and anti-Semitism in America and worldwide. So he's a longtime friend of our congregation. I know you don't want to miss these. Well, this is truly a week of study and Torah and learning. So thank you again, Professor, coming from Yerushalayim. Have a great evening. Thank you for staying up late with us. And we'll see you next week on Tuesday at 11 at Pacific time.
Be well. Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.